In February of 2005, a man named Bob Cranmer caught his dog standing like a statue staring up the stairs, so he quickly snapped this photo. Later, when the film was developed, this ghostly image appeared on the picture. Bob Cranmer claims that an evil presence almost destroyed his family. This is his story. Welcome to Rope. If you're new here, all we do is report the facts of unexplained events. We do a ton of research, and we stick to the record. We don't fabricate anything, and then we let you decide what really happened. So, with that in mind, if there is something mysterious that you've always wanted to learn about, please drop us a line in the comments. I have a secret weapon. Amy is an amazing researcher, and we'll see what she can dig up for you. This report is about a family's fight to keep their home against what they claim was an evil entity. Their nightmare began in December of 1988, and it didn't end until February of 2006. They say that it was absolutely horrifying and almost impossible to get through. They say that between those years, they experienced a plethora of unexplainable and terrifying events, including every family member seeing a dark-hooded, sinister-looking man in a black cape, and almost every family member experiencing a strange depression that he or she just couldn't shake. And Bob Cranmer, the man of the house, finding out that before the family moved in, now this is horrific, bodies had actually been burned in his basement furnace. Obviously, we don't have enough time in this short report to share every single detail of what happened during this 17-and-a-half-year period. But we will go over all of the significant points and give you a clear picture of what the family swears happened. This case was weird from the very beginning, and it starts with several bizarre oddities. The Cranmers, Robert and Lisa, and their 4 children, Jessica, Bobby, David, and Charlie, moved into this 7-bedroom home on December 12, 1988. And from the very start, things were odd. At first, the Cranmers didn't think that they could afford the house. It was quite a bit more than they wanted to spend, but it was exactly what they wanted. So Bob Cranmer made them a ridiculously low offer, lowballing the asking price by $30,000 below market value, something that he and Lisa knew that no sellers in their right mind would go for, kind of a Hail Mary or a shot in the dark. But they were very surprised when the sellers came back and accepted that offer. That was the first odd thing about this house. The second was perhaps even more odd. When Bob first met with the sellers at the house for the walkthrough, for some reason, the sellers went out of their way to let Bob know that this house was absolutely safe, even to the point of saying that, get this, they had successfully held mass in the house. Now, I have to tell you, when Amy shared that part with me, it struck me as extremely odd. I have purchased and sold several homes over the years, and never once did the discussion of religion ever come into the conversation. No one ever assured me that the house that I was wanting to buy was so safe that one could even hold mass in it. Another thing about the house that was odd was the size. This house, believe it or not, is exactly 4,444 square feet. While she was doing the research for this report, Amy thought that that was just a tiny bit strange, so she verified it. She actually looked this address up on several different real estate sites, and sure enough, it's currently listed as being 4,444 square feet. And because it did seem just a bit odd, being 4444, she did a little research on the number 4, really thinking that she probably wouldn't find anything significant enough to put into our report. But check this out. She found that in one of the oldest religions in the world, no lie, the number 4 represents, wait for it, a doorway or a passageway. A gateway, perhaps, to another world? The last thing that was odd about the house was that one of the bedrooms on the second floor had one of those old-fashioned door knockers on the outside in the hall. Now, that's something that one usually sees on the front door of a house, not on the door of a bedroom. And after Mr. and Mrs. Cranmer bought the house and brought the children to see it, young Bobby, who was only 3 years old at the time, felt drawn to that room. And he went inside, he looked around, and he told his parents that that was his room. And maybe that's something that he shouldn't have done. Shortly after the family moved into the house, everyone said that they started to hear these strange sounds. They said that they heard knocking all throughout the house and footsteps right outside of their bedroom doors in the hallway. But Bob, doing his best to be a good husband and a good father, assured his family that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He said that this was just an older house, and these older homes like this often have these strange settling sounds. But even as he was saying that, secretly, even he was starting to think that maybe there was something off with the house. For one thing, he also heard these same sounds, and he had a very difficult time imagining them as just settling sounds. It really did sound like someone was knocking on the walls and walking down the hallway. But there were a few things that really made him think. First, there was a coat closet right next to the front door, and it had this pull chain that when you pulled it, it would turn the light on. And when Bob would come home from work, it was that closet that he would hang up his coat in. But every time that he reached for that chain, it would be missing. So he would fumble around, grabbing in the dark, and he'd always find the chain, check this out, wrapped up around the light fixture that it was hanging from. He asked his wife about it. Why did you wrap the chain around the light fixture? But she just looked at him dumbfoundedly, like she had no idea what he was talking about. Another thing that made Bob think that there just might be something more to these strange noises was how this chair in the basement would always be out of place. Each morning, before he left for work, he'd go downstairs and he would check on this wood-burning stove that was down there. And each time he did, he'd find that a chair, which he usually kept up under a workbench, would be out in the middle of the basement, facing the stove, as if someone had been up the night before, sitting in the chair, just watching the fire. And the last thing that gave Bob pause had to do with something that he found out in the yard, something that belonged to the previous owners. Well, actually, it Turns out, this something that belonged to the previous owners had more to do with the people who lived in the house before they did. And at this point, I could see how this report could get all tangled up and go south very quickly. So we need to stop for just a second and go over a quick history of the house. My researcher, Amy, pulled up the real estate records for this house, and it dates all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. And I think you'll probably understand this best if you hear this part from Amy. So I'm going to let her share this part with you. Amy?
Thank you, Damon. This house at 3406 Brownsville Road in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was built in 1909, and a couple by the names of Preston and Louise Malik took out a loan to build the house, and the loan was provided by a Mr. and Mrs. Wagner. But shortly after the house was built, the Great Depression hit, and the Maliks couldn't make good on their loan. So the Wagners eventually repossessed the house, and then the house sat empty for a bit. And then later, a couple that Bob Cranmer only refers to as the McHenrys, well, they bought the house, and it was the McHenrys who sold the house to the Cranmers.
Thank you, Amy. And it was the McHenrys who accepted that lowball offer, $30,000 below market value. And it was the McHenrys who insisted on the fact that mass could be held in this house. So please, keep that in mind as I share this next part. Just a few months after the Cranmers moved in, during the very first spring that they lived there, Bob was out doing some gardening in the front yard. And as he was digging with one of those little handheld shovels, he found a small metal box buried about 6 inches below the ground. And it was obvious that the box hadn't been in the ground very long. And when he opened it, he found some rosary beads and several religious artifacts. And the artifacts looked like they just might be a little bit valuable. So thinking that maybe this was important to the McHenrys, perhaps something they accidentally forgot when they moved out, he went into the house and he called them. When he did, check this out. They sounded nervous. What did you dig up? And they told him in no uncertain terms that he needed to put that box back where he found it, and he needed to do it now. When he asked them why, they refused to answer. When he pressed them further, they just abruptly ended the call. After that, these mysterious events in the house just intensified like crazy. Not long after Bob Cranmer exhumed that small metal box full of those religious artifacts in his front yard, the family started experiencing bizarre events that even he couldn't explain away. The first strange thing that happened was these puddles of red, brown, and orange liquid would appear all over the house. And appliances and other electrical items would, for some reason, be found unplugged. And when they were plugged back in, they wouldn't work for a while, only to start functioning just fine later. Pictures would suddenly fall off the wall, slam into the floor, and startle everyone half to death. And even stranger than that, some pictures would still be on the wall. Just check this out. Instead of being where they were hung in the first place, they would be hanging in an entirely different location on another wall. And the knocking sounds? Well, they got louder, and they turned into pounding, and they increased in frequency. And it got so bad that finally they just could not be rationalized as just settling sounds. Someone or something was intentionally knocking on the walls. Furniture started being found out of place. A chair next to the television just might be found up against a wall, and a couch might be found turned all the way around. The water faucets in the kitchen and the bathrooms would come on at all hours of the day or night when no one was in those rooms. And once in a while, something truly dangerous would happen. For instance, from time to time, the clothes iron was found turned on and burning holes through articles of clothing, and had it not been caught, it would most have certainly burned the house down. Although these things were frightening, the really scary stuff was what was happening to each family member on the inside, and none of them knew that it was happening to any of the others, at least not at first. A depression was slowly eating away at everyone, and poor Bobby, who was living in that room with the knocker on the outside, was the first one to go, and he was most certainly the most severely affected. As all of these unexplainable and sometimes terrifying events were taking place inside the house, everyone, with the exception of Bob Cranmer, who was usually away from the house at work, was filling up with a strange depression. But this depression was happening so slowly that no one really noticed it. Bobby, who, as we will soon find out, was most certainly living in the wrong bedroom, would well up with an unnatural anxiety and a loneliness, and he wouldn't have a clue of what to do. And while this anxiety and loneliness was inside of him, he would often feel an eerie presence there in his bedroom with him. And he would see these ghostly images out of the corner of his eye. And when he would turn his head to look, these images would just vanish into nothing. At first, he would pull the blankets up over his head and wait for everything to go away. But eventually, that wasn't enough. And on several different mornings, his parents found him in the bedroom closet, cowering in the corner, with the closet light on, shaking. Bobby is an adult now, and he still maintains that while he lived in that house, these unexplainable things happened to him. And as I said earlier, we don't have enough time to share all of them. But to give you an idea of what Bobby says that he went through, let me just share this one event. Bobby was in the 5th grade, and on this particular day, he stayed home from school sick. His mother, Lisa, went to get some medicine while he waited in bed, home alone. And as he was under the covers, looking out of the window, bored, he heard some faint music coming from somewhere in the house. Now remember, no one is home but Bobby. So he paused and he focused on the sound and he listened carefully. And as he did, the music grew louder. And he said it sounded like bagpipes playing. He described the moment like this.
The music got louder and louder, and then the door to my room opened, and this thing came into my room. It was made out of what looked like static or lightning bolts in the shape of a kid's body. It had no face. It seemed to hop or skip as it came in. Stood at the foot of my bed, and then went back out the door.
As Bobby was laying there, now petrified and staring at the door where this ball of static electricity in the form of a child just ran, he saw another figure go past the door on the outside in the hallway, as if it were chasing that child.
I stared out the door, and this dark figure, one that I can only describe as looking like the Grim Reaper, ran past. Kept staring in shock, and then I saw a hand with a black robe on its arm reach out into my room. So I pulled my blankets over my head in terror. The blankets were ripped out of my hands and flew to my feet, folded perfectly. And suddenly there was another figure floating above me, looking down at me. If you took a human body and turned it into a light bulb, that's what it looked like. It had no facial features at all. I closed my eyes and screamed really loud. It all stopped. I stayed in bed until my mom got home, but I didn't say anything.
according to Bob Cranmer, each member of the family claimed, and still stand by that claim, that on more than one occasion, he or she saw this same dark, shadowy figure. They all say that it would appear as either a misty black cloud or, check this out, sometimes it would appear in solid human form. And whenever it was in this human form, it had straight jet black hair that was about shoulder length, and it wore a black cloak that covered its entire body from its neck to the floor. They said that it would often be accompanied by a gut-wrenching stench like burning rubber mixed with sulfur. Eventually, the depression that the family was fading into became so obvious that no one could ignore it anymore. And as I said earlier, it affected Bobby, who was living in that room the most. And as he got older, he actually started changing his appearance, wearing black, gloomy clothing, dark eyeliner, and listening to very depressing gothic music. And then one day, he just snapped. He went into this wild rage, and he attacked his father. Wanting to do his part to help pull his family out of this depression, Bob Cranmer started investing more and more time into each family member. And sometimes it helped, but more often than not, it created this strange backlash that just made things worse. On Sunday, September 14th, 2003, Bob took his two sons, Bobby and Charlie, out for the day. Bob said that it was a very good day. He said that the three of them felt very connected and happy while they were out. But just a couple of hours after they returned to the house, he said that Bobby did a complete 180-degree flip, and he physically attacked his father.
A few hours after we got home, I went downstairs to confront Bobby over his leaving my bathroom in total disarray, with his clothes and wet towels strewn all over the floor. He screamed, "F*** you," and went into a wild rage and began to attack me. By then he was no longer a child, and in fact weighed about 20 pounds more than me due to the antidepressants he was on. He knocked me down and began to pummel me and yelled he was going to kill me. I noticed that he didn't sound like himself. His voice was very deep, and it was almost impossible to control his strength or the violence of his blows. We fought throughout the first floor of the house until I finally overpowered him in the kitchen.
After that, Bob Cranmer knew that he had to get to the bottom of all of this, or he was going to lose his family. So he called a local convent, and he spoke to a nun that he knew, named Mother Maria.
Mother Maria, something's going on here that's unnatural. I believe my house is occupied by some kind of supernatural force.
Mother Maria listened, and to Bob's surprise, instead of thinking that Bob was crazy, she told him that there was a phenomenon called demonic infestation. She said that it wasn't all that uncommon, and she said that it occurred in places where serious sins had taken place. Bob listened as she spoke, and he thought about it. Serious sins? What serious sins could have happened inside of Bob's house? Before the call was through, she gave Bob a phone number to a local monastery. She said that they do something that's called deliverance work. So to make a long story short, Bob called the monastery, and eventually he was put in touch with a priest named Father Ed. And Father Ed suggested that the first thing that they should do was to hold a few church services inside the house. So Bob spoke to his family, and everyone prepared to hold Catholic Mass inside the house. Over the next few months, they held several services inside the house, and during these services, each family member contributed in some significant way. And although everyone was very serious, and they blessed the house, and they prayed for deliverance, nothing changed. Basically, the haunting and the depression just continued. As a matter of fact, it got worse. Now, I have to stop right here. And I have to say, if this were happening to me and to my family, I would take my family and we would move. And Bob said that at one point, he and his wife had a serious discussion about doing that very thing. And they decided that this was their house, and they weren't going to be bullied into leaving. They were going to fight for their home. So Bob kept searching. He kept looking for an answer, and finally he was put in touch with a mysterious priest named Father Ron Langwin. This Father Ron Langwin never did come out to the house, but seemingly he knew things that he just should not have known. By now, it was June of 2004, and Bob was told to call a priest by the name of Father Ron Langwin. He was supposed to call Father Ron Langwin at precisely 7 p.m. Bob called, and the voice on the other end of the line skipped the small talk and just jumped right to the point. He asked Bob if there was one particular room in Bob's house that seemed to have a bit more turmoil and spiritual activity than any of the others, and Bob instantly thought of Bobby's room. Father Ron continued, and he said that the room that he was talking about was at the top of the stairs to the left, and that indeed was Bobby's room. Father Ron said that horrible atrocities had taken place in that room. Over the next several weeks, Bob and Father Ron had several different phone calls, and during each call, Father Ron would describe areas of the house and property that he couldn't possibly have known about. And he would describe them perfectly, as if he were standing right there beside Bob as he spoke. At one point, he directed Bob's attention to the second floor, but to the right of the stairs, and he asked if there was an old antique mirror there. And Bob, on the phone, standing in front of the mirror, said, "Yes, there's one right here." Father Ron asked if there was a doorway beside the mirror leading into another room. Bob said, "Yes, it leads into the bathroom." Father Ron said that gallons and gallons of blood had went through that bathroom. It's enough to give you chills, isn't it? Then Father Ron started talking about the basement. He said that terrible, terrible things once occurred with the furnace in the basement. And Bob instantly thought about that chair that was always facing the furnace in the mornings. And a cold chill ran down his spine. Then Father Ron told Bob to go out onto the front porch, and he directed his attention to a house with green trim just a few doors down. And there indeed was a house exactly like Father Ron described. Father Ron said that a man who lived in that house during the 1920s and the 1930s would occasionally come to the house that Bob now lived in. Father Ron said that this man would leave his coat and his hat in the closet near the front door. And then Bob thought about how he could never find that pull chain in the closet. Father Ron said that the man would then go upstairs to the room with that old-fashioned door knocker on it, and he would conduct sinister business in that room. And then the man would wash all the blood off of his hands in the bathroom, and then take the bodies to the furnace in the basement, and then he would finally dump their ashes in Bob's backyard. Father Ron asked if there was a large climbing rose bush in the right-hand corner of Bob's backyard. And Bob said, yes, there was. And he said that the roses that were there were blood red. Father Ron said that that's where the man dumped the ashes. This is intense. So at this point, I had Amy do a little bit of digging and try to verify some of this information, do a little bit more research. and she found a couple of eerie tidbits that I think would probably be best heard from her. Amy?
So I did a little extra digging, and I found out that Bob Cranmer actually wrote a book about his experiences, and I got the Kindle edition. It's titled The Demon of Brownsville Road. And in this book, Bob writes how he, Father Linguin, and a Catholic mystic named Connie Valenti all speak of a mysterious doctor. They only refer to him as Dr. M. And all three said he was a pediatrician. And they implied that he did in fact live just a couple of doors down from the house that the Cranmers moved into. Now, they say that this Dr. M started his practice around 1915, and eventually he even operated a hospital that treated people in an area called the South Side Slopes. Now, this doctor died in the late 1950s, and Bob Cranmer said that the one source he spoke with said that Dr. M was a very rough and profane old man who liked to drink and always smelled like liquor. He walked with a limp and he used a cane, and he always wore a black hat and white gloves. Now, the underlying implication here, of course, is that during the Depression, he was performing illegal abortions for extra money.
So, Bob Cranmer said at this point, it all started to make sense. Preston and Louise Malek took out a loan to build the house, but then the Great Depression hit, and they fell on hard times. The doctor, who lived just a couple of doors down, wanted a discreet room from which to run his illegal abortion clinic. The Maleks needed the money, so the doctor rented the room in their house and placed that door knocker on the outside. Whenever he'd come to work, he'd hang up his coat and his hat in the closet near the front door. He'd use the room at the top of the stairs to perform his abortions, and then he would burn the infant bodies in the furnace in the basement. Finally, he would dump the ashes in the backyard where that blood-red rosebush is now. This story truly gives me chills. Eventually, Bob found the right person and had a full-blown exorcism performed on the house. And for the most part, the haunting and the depression stopped, but not in the basement. So shortly after the first exorcism, another one was performed, just in the basement. And after that, the haunting and the depression completely went away. And today, the house is just like any other ordinary house. And it's actually ran as a bed and breakfast by Bob Cranmer. First, let me start by saying that Bob and Lisa Cranmer and several other witnesses swear that these events did in fact take place, just as we've shared them with you. But, like many other stories of the supernatural, there really is no hard physical evidence to back up their statements. The entire 17-year account is almost solely built on these eyewitness testimonies. And most of the testimony that we shared with you comes from Bob Cranmer himself. And many of the things that Bob Cranmer says about the house's history are strongly disputed by others. For example, Bob says that as he was digging up the history of the house, he spoke with a woman named Barbara Paisley. She's a daughter to the Wagners. And he asked her if she had ever experienced anything supernatural or spiritual in the house. Bob says that she told him, quote, "Oh yes, many times." But the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette published an interview with Barbara Paisley's daughter, Karen Dwyer, and she said that other than squirrels in the walls, she never experienced anything out of the ordinary. She also said that her mother never said that anything happened in the house, that the house was haunted. She said that her grandmother never said that the house was haunted. And she said that if Bob wants to write a ghost story from 1988 on, well, go for it. But if he wants to lie about other people's experiences in the house, that's just not right. And this mysterious doctor who supposedly performed those abortions in the house? Well, this information solely rests on the words of Bob Cranmer, Father Ron Langwin, and Connie Valente. And when pressed, according to J.D. Sword from the Skeptical Inquirer, all three of them kind of just fizzled out. Father Langwin said that he didn't need to verify the story in order to tell it. And Connie Valente said that, well, as far as her visions go, the story, it's spot on. And Bob Cranmer, well, he basically refused to talk about it. And although a lot of this story does seem vague and difficult to verify, there are a few points that still makes a person go, like, why was that door knocker on the outside of that bedroom door? And it is a tad bit interesting. The house is exactly 4,444 square feet. And then there's that photo of that dog doing that strange stare with some sort of a skeletal blur on the picture. And I don't know if it's right to dismiss an entire account based on some of Bob Cranmer's statements seemingly being just a bit too much. Don't forget, there were other people involved, more people than just Bob Cranmer. His wife Lisa, who isn't with him anymore, swears that these events did in fact take place. And Bobby, he's an adult now, and he also independently says that he personally saw that dark evil figure in his room, and he experienced this horrific haunting for years. And you know, it's so easy to dismiss eyewitness accounts that seem to be just a bit off the norm just because we didn't experience it ourselves. But in the end, the Cranmer's story truly is a haunted mystery. Thank you for checking out this report. I'm Damon, and this is the channel's researcher, Amy.
Remember, we currently post new videos every other Thursday, and we share information on aliens, ghosts, cryptids, and other unexplainable stories.
And, well, with that, I guess it ties it up for another report here on Rope. Thank you.